Ben Whitehorse dropped his morning coffee, the ceramic mug shattering against the cabin's wooden floor as he stared at the sight before him. Two wolf cubs sat motionless in his yard, their golden eyes locked on his. But something was terribly wrong. They weren't making a sound. In 40 years of forest ranging, Ben had never encountered wolves this silent. Cubs their age should be whimpering, playing, calling for their mother. Instead, they sat like carved statues, the larger one positioned protectively over the smaller, both trembling despite the mild Tennessee autumn air. His neighbor's dog began howling frantically from across the valley, sensing something Ben's human ears couldn't detect. The cubs didn't even flinch. Their silence felt unnatural, broken, like spirits that had forgotten how to speak. Ben's weathered hands shook as he reached for his phone. 3 years ago, he'd failed to save his own son, David. Now, fate had delivered two more orphaned souls to his doorstep. What had stolen their voices? And how much time did he have before whatever broke them came back to finish the job? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Great Smoky Mountains had been home to 4 generations of Whitehorses, but Benjamin Ben Whitehorse had never felt more alone on the 40 acres his Cherokee great-grandfather had passed down through blood and sacrifice. At 68, his weathered hands told the story of a life spent protecting these ancient hills, first as head forest ranger for 35 years, now as their reluctant guardian in retirement. The cabin that had once echoed with Martha's laughter and David's childhood adventures now held only memories and mounting bills. Medical debt from Martha's cancer treatment had climbed to $47,000, a mountain of paper that threatened to bury the last Whitehorse standing. His monthly Social Security check of $1,200 barely covered utilities and the diabetes medication that kept him upright, let alone the mortgage payments that grew more impossible each month. "These mountains raised 4 generations of Whitehorses," Ben muttered to the empty kitchen, fingering the foreclosure notice that had arrived yesterday. "I won't be the one to lose them." But pride couldn't pay bills, and stubbornness wouldn't stop the bank from seizing what his family had fought to keep for over a century. 25 miles down the winding mountain road, in the struggling township of Millbrook, Dr. Elizabeth "Liz" Clearwater was fighting her own losing battle. Her veterinary clinic, once the heart of a thriving rural community, now served a dwindling population of farmers who could barely afford to feed their livestock, let alone pay for medical care. At 54, Liz had devoted her life to healing wounded animals, a calling that had cost her the chance for children of her own, but had never once made her question her purpose. The irony wasn't lost on her that she could mend broken bones and heal infected wounds, yet couldn't repair the economic cancer eating away at their mountain community. Young families fled to Nashville and Knoxville, leaving behind elderly residents on fixed incomes and a main street dotted with empty storefronts. Her clinic's debt had reached $180,000, and the bank's patience was wearing as thin as autumn mountain air. What neither Ben nor Liz knew was that Tom Ravencroft was already in town, checking into the Millbrook Inn with blueprints for a $50 million resort development. The polished Atlanta businessman, with his expensive suits and calculating smile, represented everything their mountain community had resisted for generations: progress that came at the cost of heritage, prosperity that demanded the sacrifice of sacred ground. Tom's geological surveys and legal documents painted a picture of inevitable change. The Cherokee burial grounds on Ben's property, the healing springs that had drawn his ancestors to this valley, the wildlife corridors that had remained untouched since before the first European settler, all of it could disappear beneath concrete and manicured lawns if the right pressure was applied in the right places. But Tom Ravencroft carried secrets deeper than his business plans, secrets that would shake the very foundations of what it meant to be family in these ancient hills. The silence was what haunted Ben most. In 4 decades of working these mountains, he'd learned to read the forest's moods through sound, the warning chatter of squirrels, the territorial calls of hawks, the playful yips of fox kits learning to hunt. But these two wolf cubs communicated through a language of stillness that spoke of trauma too deep for words. Echo, the larger of the two, couldn't have been more than 4 months old, yet he carried himself with the weary vigilance of an old soul. His coat, a mixture of silver and charcoal, bore small scars along his flanks, neat, precise marks that spoke of human interference rather than natural injury. The cub positioned himself like a guardian between his companion and any potential threat, never relaxing, never letting his amber eyes stray from Ben's movements. Whisper, smaller and more delicate, bore the unmistakable signs of prolonged captivity. Her left hind leg favored slightly, and when she moved, it was with the careful precision of an animal that had learned to minimize pain. But it was her eyes that broke Ben's heart, large and golden like her companions, but dulled with a resignation no wild creature should ever possess. She hadn't made a sound since he'd found them, not even the soft whimpers that should accompany breathing. Ben knelt on his porch, placing a bowl of warm goat's milk 6 feet from where the cubs huddled together. "Easy now," he whispered, his voice carrying the same gentle cadence he'd once used with David during childhood nightmares. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." Echo's ears twitched at the sound, but neither cub moved toward the offering. They'd clearly been fed by humans before. Their lack of natural fear proved that. But something had shattered their trust so completely that even the smell of food couldn't overcome their paralysis. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the yard, and still the cubs remained motionless. Ben's knees protested against the wooden porch planks, but he didn't dare move. Some instinct told him that any sudden motion might send them fleeing into the forest, where their chances of survival were slim at best. His phone buzzed against his hip. Probably another collection call he couldn't afford to answer. The medical bills from Martha's final months had arrived with ruthless regularity, each envelope containing numbers that might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the hope Ben had of paying them. $47,000 might as well be $47 million when you're living on Social Security and stubborn pride. But looking at these broken cubs, Ben felt something stir in his chest that had been dormant since David's funeral 3 years ago. Purpose. The dangerous, intoxicating feeling that maybe his story wasn't over yet, that maybe these mountains had sent him something to save, and in saving them, save himself. By noon, with the cubs still refusing to eat and the Tennessee sun climbing toward its peak, Ben made a decision that would have made his forest ranger supervisors proud and his accountant weep. He reached for his phone and scrolled through contacts until he found the number he was looking for. "Liz, it's Ben Whitehorse. I need your help." Dr. Elizabeth Clearwater arrived within the hour, her battered pickup truck navigating the winding dirt road with the confidence of someone who'd made house calls to every remote corner of the county. She climbed out carrying her veterinary bag and a thermos of coffee that sent steam curling into the cool mountain air. "Jesus, Ben," she breathed, catching sight of the cubs. "Where did you find them?" "Edge of the old Cherokee burial ground just after dawn." Ben kept his voice low, mindful of the cubs' skittish state. "They were just sitting there, like they were waiting for something." Liz approached with the measured steps of someone accustomed to dealing with traumatized animals. Her trained eye cataloged details that Ben had missed: the precise spacing of the scars on Echo's flanks, the way Whisper held her injured leg, the unnatural stillness that spoke of learned helplessness rather than natural caution. "These aren't wild cubs," she said, settling onto the porch beside Ben. "Look at their behavior. Wild cubs this age would either run or attack. These two have been in human captivity long enough to suppress their natural responses." The implications hung heavy between them. Wolf cubs didn't end up in captivity by accident. Someone had taken them from their pack, possibly killed their parents, and kept them confined long enough to break something fundamental in their spirits. The question is, Liz continued, opening her bag to retrieve a small pair of binoculars, why are they here now? And where are the people who had them? Through the magnified lenses, the evidence of human interference became even more apparent. Both cubs wore the subtle signs of medical intervention, small shaved patches where IVs had been inserted, the telltale marks of restraints around their muzzles, and most disturbing of all, tiny puncture wounds behind their ears that suggested some form of sedation or tracking device. "Ben, we need to call this in," Liz said, lowering the binoculars. These cubs were stolen from somewhere, probably from a wildlife preserve or rehabilitation center. There's likely a reward and definitely people looking for them. The words hit Ben like a physical blow. A reward. The kind of money that could solve his mortgage problem, pay off Martha's medical bills, and secure his remaining years on the land his family had called home for generations. All he had to do was make a phone call and turn over two helpless creatures to whatever bureaucratic system had already failed them once. "What if," Ben's voice came out rougher than he intended, "what if we don't call it in right away? Just until they're stronger, until we know they'll be safe." Liz studied his face, reading the desperation he was trying to hide. As a veterinarian in a rural community, she'd seen enough broken animals to recognize the signs in humans too. Ben Whitehorse was drowning, and these cubs represented either salvation or the final weight that would pull him under. 24 hours, she said finally. We give them 24 hours to show some sign of recovery. If they don't improve, we make the call. As if summoned by their decision, a black sedan appeared at the bottom of Ben's long driveway, moving slowly up the gravel road with the deliberate pace of someone unfamiliar with mountain terrain. The cubs sensed the approaching vehicle before the humans heard it, Echo's hackles rising slightly while Whisper pressed closer to the porch steps. The car stopped 50 yards from the cabin, and a man in an expensive suit climbed out, adjusting his tie as he surveyed the property with calculating eyes. He was younger than Ben, probably in his early 50s, with the kind of polished appearance that screamed city money and corporate ambition. "Mr. Whitehorse?" the stranger called out, his voice carrying the slight southern accent of someone who'd spent time away from the mountains but hadn't entirely lost his roots. "My name is Tom Ravencroft. I believe we need to talk." Tom Ravencroft approached with the measured confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, but something in his stride faltered when his eyes fell on the two wolf cubs. For just a moment, the polished businessman's mask slipped, revealing something raw and unguarded beneath. He stopped 10 feet from the porch, his leather shoes already dusted with the red clay that clung to everything in these mountains. "Beautiful animals," he said, his voice softer than his appearance suggested. "Mind if I ask where you found them?" Ben's weathered hands tightened around his coffee mug. 40 years of dealing with government officials, land developers, and various other threats to his mountain sanctuary had taught him to read men like Tom Ravencroft. They usually wanted something, and they rarely cared about the cost to others. "I mind," Ben replied, his Cherokee grandmother's wisdom echoing in his memory. "Never trust a man who asks questions before introducing himself properly." Tom's smile was practiced but didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. Forgive my manners." He reached into his jacket pocket, producing a business card that probably cost more than Ben's monthly grocery budget. "Thomas Ravencroft, Southeast Regional Development Corporation. We specialize in sustainable eco-tourism projects that benefit local communities while preserving natural heritage." Liz accepted the card, studying it with the same careful attention she gave to suspicious X-rays. "Eco-tourism," she repeated, the skepticism clear in her voice. "And what brings you to Mr. Whitehorse's property?" "Opportunity," Tom said, spreading his arms to encompass the vast forest that stretched beyond Ben's 40 acres. "These mountains are sitting on untapped potential. Tourism revenue that could revitalize the entire county, create hundreds of jobs, bring young families back to communities like Millbrook." The cubs had retreated further under the porch steps, sensing the tension in the adults' voices, even if they couldn't understand the words. Echo's protective stance never wavered, but Ben noticed how the cubs' attention seemed particularly focused on Tom, as if recognizing some familiar threat. "Not interested," Ben said flatly. "This land's not for sale." Tom's laugh held no humor. "Mr. Whitehorse, I've done my research. Your property taxes alone are bleeding you dry, and that's before we factor in the medical debt from your late wife's treatment." He gestured toward the peeling paint on the cabin's exterior, the sagging fence line, the obvious signs of deferred maintenance. "How long do you think you can hold on to this place on Social Security?" The brutal accuracy of Tom's assessment hit Ben like a physical blow. Every word was true, every financial detail laid bare with surgical precision, but the fact that this stranger had been investigating his private affairs made Ben's jaw clench with barely controlled anger. "My finances are none of your business, son." "Actually, they are," Tom replied, pulling a folder from his briefcase. "When properties of historical and cultural significance are at risk of foreclosure, it becomes a matter of public interest. The state has programs designed to prevent the loss of irreplaceable heritage sites." He opened the folder, revealing geological surveys, historical documents, and photographs that Ben recognized as his own property, shot from angles that suggested aerial surveillance. The violation of privacy was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. "The Cherokee burial ground on your land is one of only 3 intact sites remaining in this region," Tom continued, his tone shifting to something resembling reverence. "The healing springs your great-grandfather built his cabin around have cultural significance that extends far beyond property lines. These aren't just family heirlooms, Mr. Whitehorse. They're treasures that belong to all of us." Liz stepped closer to Ben, her veterinarian instincts recognizing predatory behavior even in human form. "And I suppose your development company is volunteering to preserve these treasures out of the goodness of your hearts?" Tom's smile returned, but this time it carried a sharper edge. "We're prepared to offer Mr. Whitehorse $150,000 for his 40 acres. That's more than enough to clear his debts and provide comfortable retirement income. In return, we'll create the Whitehorse Cherokee Heritage and Wellness Resort, ensuring that the cultural sites are preserved in perpetuity while generating sustainable revenue for the community." The offer hung in the air like morning fog, beautiful and insubstantial. Ben's rational mind immediately began calculating. 150,000 would indeed clear his debts, pay off the mortgage, and leave enough for a modest apartment in town. He could live out his remaining years without the constant worry of foreclosure notices and collection calls. But something deeper than financial pragmatism rebelled against the idea. This land held the bones of his ancestors, the memories of his marriage, the ghost of his son's laughter echoing through trees that had watched over 4 generations of Whitehorses. How do you put a price tag on the place where your soul learned to recognize home? "Not for sale," Ben repeated, but his voice lacked the certainty it had carried moments before. Tom sensed the weakness like a predator scenting wounded prey. "Mr. Whitehorse, be reasonable. You're 68 years old, living alone on property you can't afford to maintain. What happens when your health fails? When the next medical emergency hits?" "These mountains won't love you back, sir. They'll just watch you struggle until the banks take everything anyway." Echo chose that moment to emerge from beneath the porch steps, his amber eyes fixed on Tom with unmistakable hostility. The cub's lips pulled back in a silent snarl, revealing teeth that were still small but promised future lethality. Whisper remained hidden, but Ben could see her trembling through the gap between the wooden planks. "Interesting," Tom observed, studying Echo's aggressive posture. "Wolves this young shouldn't show that level of territorial behavior toward humans. Unless—" He trailed off, his expression sharpening with sudden interest. "Unless they've been conditioned to respond to specific types of people." The implication sent a chill down Ben's spine. Tom's knowledge seemed to extend beyond real estate development into areas that raised uncomfortable questions. How did a businessman from Atlanta know enough about wolf behavior to make such observations? "I think you should leave," Liz interjected, her protective instincts fully aroused. "Mr. Whitehorse has given you his answer." Tom straightened his tie, the gesture somehow conveying both dismissal and warning. "Of course. But before I go, you should know that the county is under increasing pressure to address properties that pose public safety risks. Harboring wild animals without proper permits, for instance. The State Wildlife Commission takes such violations very seriously." The threat was delivered with the same polished smile Tom had worn throughout the conversation, but its implications were crystal clear. He knew about the cubs, knew they were likely there illegally, and was prepared to use that knowledge as leverage. "You have 48 hours to reconsider my offer," Tom continued, walking back toward his sedan. "After that, I'm afraid the terms may become less favorable." And the bureaucratic process has a way of complicating things that could otherwise be handled simply and amicably. As the black car disappeared down the mountain road, Ben and Liz stood in heavy silence. The cubs remained hidden beneath the porch, their earlier trauma clearly triggered by Tom's presence. Whatever these animals had endured, it had left them with an instinctive fear of men who carried themselves with Tom's particular brand of predatory confidence. "There's something not right about him," Liz said finally. "His knowledge of wolf behavior, the way the cubs reacted to him specifically. And how did he know to come here so soon after you found them?" Ben nodded grimly. "Been thinking the same thing. Man like that doesn't just happen to drive up a mountain road the day after two traumatized wolf cubs appear on my property." The implications were troubling. If Tom was somehow connected to the cubs' mysterious appearance, then Ben and Liz might have stumbled into something far more dangerous than a simple real estate transaction. The cubs' silence suddenly seemed less like trauma and more like wisdom, the kind of survival instinct that kept prey animals alive in the presence of predators. As evening shadows lengthened across the cabin yard, Ben made a decision that would bind his fate to that of two orphaned cubs who had lost their voices, but not their capacity for love. Whatever Tom Ravencroft was really after, Ben wouldn't let him have it without a fight. The next morning brought rain to the Smoky Mountains, a gentle persistence that turned the dirt roads to mud and filled the forest with the earthy scent of renewal. Ben woke to find Echo sitting vigil by his bedroom window, the cub's amber eyes tracking every movement in the gray dawn. Whisper remained curled in the corner they'd claimed as their own, her injured leg tucked carefully beneath her small body. For the first time since their arrival, both cubs had eaten during the night. The bowl of warm goat's milk sat empty on the kitchen floor, and Ben felt a surge of hope that made his chest tight with emotion. Small victories, Martha used to say during her cancer treatment. Celebrate the small victories because they add up to something bigger than the sum of their parts. "Morning, little ones," Ben whispered, settling into his rocking chair with a cup of coffee that tasted better than it had in months. "Looks like you decided to trust the crazy old man after all." Echo's ears swiveled toward the sound of his voice, and for a moment Ben thought he saw something like recognition in the cub's gaze. Not the blank wariness of a traumatized animal, but the cautious hope of a creature beginning to remember what safety felt like. The peaceful moment shattered when Ben's phone rang, the harsh electronic sound sending both cubs scrambling for cover beneath the kitchen table. The caller ID showed Millbrook Community Bank, and Ben's stomach clenched with familiar dread. "Mr. Whitehorse?" came the clipped voice of Loan Officer Patricia Henderson, a woman who'd been calling with increasing frequency as his financial situation deteriorated. "I hope you've had time to consider our conversation about restructuring your loan payments." Ben stepped onto the porch, unwilling to subject the cubs to the stress of another human conflict. Through the window, he watched Echo emerge from hiding to check on Whisper, the larger cub's protective instincts overriding his own fear. "Patricia, I told you I need more time." "Mr. Whitehorse, with respect, time is something we're all running short of. The bank has shown considerable patience, but our board of directors is asking pointed questions about non-performing loans. There's been an inquiry from a development company willing to assume your debt in exchange for the property deed." Tom Ravencroft. Ben's jaw tightened as he realized the man's influence extended beyond simple real estate speculation. He was systematically applying pressure from multiple angles, using Ben's financial vulnerability as a weapon. "That development company can go straight to hell," Ben growled into the phone. "Mr. Whitehorse, I understand your emotional attachment to the property, but we have a fiduciary responsibility to our shareholders. If you can't bring your account current within 30 days, we'll have no choice but to begin foreclosure proceedings." The line went dead, leaving Ben staring at his phone with the hollow feeling of a man watching his life's work slip through his fingers. $47,000 in medical debt, 18 months of missed mortgage payments, and now the vultures circling overhead in expensive suits and corporate titles. Liz arrived an hour later, her pickup truck struggling up the muddy driveway with supplies from the veterinary clinic. She'd brought antibiotics for Whisper's leg, high-calorie puppy formula to help both cubs regain weight, and a grim expression that suggested her own morning hadn't gone much better. "The State Wildlife Commission called my office," she announced without preamble. "Someone reported possible illegal possession of protected wildlife at this address. They're sending an inspector tomorrow morning." Ben felt the walls closing in around him. Tom's 48-hour deadline suddenly made perfect sense. Give him enough time to set all the pieces in motion, then watch as bureaucratic pressure and financial desperation forced the desired outcome. "There's more," Liz continued. "I did some research on Tom Ravencroft and his development company. The business registration is less than 6 months old, and the listed corporate address is a post office box in Atlanta. For a company supposedly worth $50 million, they have remarkably little public presence." She handed Ben a folder containing printouts from various websites and business databases. Southeast Regional Development Corporation existed on paper, but its digital footprint was suspiciously thin. No completed projects, no employee roster, no client testimonials, just a professional website with stock photos and carefully crafted promises. "Either he's brand new to the development business," Liz said, "or he's not really in the development business at all." Before Ben could respond, Echo appeared at the screen door, pressing his nose against the mesh with obvious distress. Both cubs had learned to associate human conversations with disruption to their fragile sense of security. Ben opened the door, and Echo trotted directly to him, sitting at his feet with the kind of deliberate trust that made Ben's throat tight with emotion. "Hey there, brave boy," Ben murmured, running his fingers through the cub's thick fur. "We're not going anywhere, I promise." But even as he spoke the words, Ben wondered if they were promises he could keep. The cubs were healing, beginning to show signs of their natural intelligence and curiosity, but they were still far from ready for release into the wild. And with the state inspector coming tomorrow, their time might be running out faster than anyone imagined. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Joseph Clearwater, Liz's uncle and one of the few remaining tribal elders who still lived on the old Cherokee lands bordering Ben's property. At 73, Joseph moved with the careful grace of a man who understood that every step was a negotiation with time and gravity, but his dark eyes remained sharp with accumulated wisdom. "Ben Whitehorse," Joseph said, settling onto the porch steps with the familiarity of old friendship. "I hear you've got some visitors staying with you." Echo and Whisper had emerged from the cabin to investigate the newcomer, their behavior markedly different from their reaction to Tom Ravencroft. Where they'd shown fear and aggression toward the businessman, they approached Joseph with curious caution, as if recognizing something in his quiet demeanor that spoke of safety. "Word travels fast in these mountains," Ben replied, accepting the gift of tobacco that Joseph offered according to old traditions. "Faster when strangers start asking questions about Cherokee burial grounds and sacred healing springs," Joseph said, his weathered hands gentle as Whisper allowed him to examine her injured leg. "This little one's been through something terrible. Both of them have." The tribal elder's touch seemed to calm Whisper in ways that even Ben's patient care hadn't achieved. She settled against Joseph's leg with a soft sigh, the first sound she'd made since arriving at the cabin. "There's something you need to know about your land, Ben," Joseph continued, his voice carrying the weight of carefully guarded secrets. "Something my grandfather told me before he passed, and his grandfather told him before that." Ben leaned forward, sensing that whatever Joseph was about to reveal would change everything. "The healing springs on your property aren't just culturally significant," Joseph said. "They're legally significant. According to the Treaty of New Echota, the one that forced the Cherokee removal, certain sacred sites were supposed to remain under tribal protection in perpetuity. The springs on your land are one of those sites." The implications hit Ben like a landslide. If Joseph was right, then the legal ownership of his property was far more complicated than any deed or mortgage document suggested. The Cherokee Nation might have valid claims that predated every subsequent transaction. "Why are you telling me this now?" Ben asked. Joseph's smile was sad but determined. "Because these mountains have a way of calling their children home when they're needed most. Your visitor, this Tom Ravencroft, he's been asking questions about mineral rights, geological surveys, things that go deeper than tourism development." As if summoned by their conversation, Tom's black sedan appeared again at the bottom of the driveway. But this time he wasn't alone. Two vehicles followed behind him, a white van with government plates and a pickup truck that belonged to Sheriff's Deputy Jake Morrison, a young man Ben had known since childhood. The cubs immediately sensed the change in atmosphere, retreating to the shadows beneath the porch while Echo maintained his protective stance. Joseph remained seated, his presence a calming anchor in the growing storm of official attention. Tom approached with three companions, a woman in a business suit carrying a clipboard, a man in wildlife service uniform with a tranquilizer gun holstered at his hip, and Deputy Morrison looking deeply uncomfortable with his assigned role. "Mr. Whitehorse," Tom began, his voice carrying artificial sympathy, "I'm sorry it's come to this, but the state has legitimate concerns about public safety. These animals need proper care that you simply can't provide." The woman with the clipboard stepped forward, her demeanor crisp and official. "I'm Agent Sarah Collins, Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency. We've received reports of illegal possession of protected wildlife. I'm here to assess the situation and determine appropriate action." Ben felt his world tilting toward an inevitable cliff edge. Everything he'd tried to protect, the cubs, his land, his family's legacy, was about to be swept away by the combined forces of bureaucracy and corporate greed. But Joseph Clearwater rose to his feet with the dignity of a man who'd spent decades fighting similar battles, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of ancient law and unbroken tradition. "Agent Collins," Joseph said, extending his hand in greeting, "I'm Joseph Clearwater, authorized representative of the Cherokee Nation's Cultural Preservation Committee. Before you proceed with any enforcement action, I believe there are some jurisdictional questions we need to discuss." The wildlife agent paused, clearly unprepared for the complication of tribal law. Tom's expression shifted from confident satisfaction to wary concern, as if sensing that his carefully orchestrated pressure campaign had encountered an unexpected obstacle. "These wolf cubs were found on land that remains under Cherokee protection according to federal treaty," Joseph continued, his words measured and precise. "Any action regarding wildlife on this property falls under tribal jurisdiction, not state authority." Echo chose that moment to emerge from beneath the porch, moving directly to Ben's side with deliberate loyalty. The message was clear. Regardless of legal complexities and bureaucratic procedures, the cub had chosen his family, and no amount of official paperwork could change that fundamental bond. As the various parties faced off in Ben's front yard, with rain beginning to fall again through the mountain mist, the old Cherokee burial ground seemed to hold its breath. The healing springs bubbled quietly in the distance, carrying the whispered prayers of generations who had fought to protect this sacred ground from those who would exploit it for profit. The battle for Ben's land, and for the souls of two traumatized cubs learning to trust again, was about to begin in earnest. The standoff in Ben's front yard stretched into uncomfortable silence as Agent Collins consulted her phone, presumably seeking guidance on the jurisdictional complications that Joseph Clearwater had introduced. Tom Ravencroft's confident demeanor had shifted to barely concealed frustration, his expensive suit looking increasingly out of place against the backdrop of ancient mountains and Cherokee wisdom. Deputy Morrison shuffled his feet in the red clay mud, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. Jake had grown up hearing stories about the White Horse family's role in protecting these mountains, and the weight of potentially evicting Ben from his ancestral land sat heavy on his young shoulders. "Mr. Clearwater," Agent Collins said finally, "while I respect tribal sovereignty, these animals pose a potential public safety risk. Wolf cubs of this age require specialized care, and there's no indication that Mr. White Horse has the proper permits or facilities." Joseph's weathered hands remained gentle on Whisper's head as the smaller cub pressed against his leg, finding comfort in his quiet presence. "Agent Collins, may I ask what specific public safety risk you're referring to? These cubs are clearly traumatized and pose no threat to anyone." Tom stepped forward, his patience visibly fraying. "The risk is obvious. Wild animals belong in the wild, not in someone's backyard. Mr. Whitehorse is a 70-year-old man with no veterinary training living alone on isolated property. What happens when these animals grow larger and their natural predatory instincts assert themselves?" Echo's response to Tom's voice was immediate and visceral. The cub's hackles rose and a low growl rumbled from his chest, the first aggressive sound either cub had made since their arrival. The reaction was so specific and targeted that everyone present couldn't help but notice that Echo showed no similar hostility toward the other strangers in the yard. "Interesting," Joseph observed, his keen eyes noting the cub's behavior. "This young one seems to recognize something threatening in your voice, Mr. Ravencroft. That kind of specific fear response typically develops from direct negative experience." The implication hung in the mountain air like morning fog. Tom's face flushed with anger, but beneath the surface emotion, Ben caught a flicker of something that looked suspiciously like guilt. "That's ridiculous," Tom snapped. "I've never seen these animals before in my life." But Echo's continued agitation suggested otherwise. The cub positioned himself between Tom and Whisper, his body language screaming protective warnings. For an animal that had been silent and withdrawn for days, his sudden vocalization spoke volumes about the source of his trauma. Liz emerged from the cabin carrying her veterinary bag, having remained inside to avoid complicating the official proceedings. But Echo's distress drew her protective instincts, and she knelt beside the agitated cub with professional calm. "Easy, boy," she murmured, checking his pulse and respiratory rate with practiced efficiency. "What's got you so worked up?" "Dr. Clearwater," Agent Collins addressed Liz formally. "As the attending veterinarian, what's your professional assessment of these animals' condition?" Liz stood slowly, her face grim with the weight of uncomfortable truths. "Both cubs show clear signs of prolonged captivity and psychological trauma. The scarring patterns on their bodies are consistent with restraint injuries, and their behavioral responses suggest systematic conditioning through negative reinforcement." She pulled out her phone, scrolling through photographs she'd taken during her initial examination. "These marks here," she pointed to precise scars on Echo's flanks, "weren't caused by natural predation or accident. They're too regular, too deliberately placed. Someone was conducting medical procedures on these animals." Tom's jaw tightened visibly. "Dr. Clearwater, you're making serious accusations without evidence. These could be injuries from any number of sources." "Could be," Liz agreed, her voice steady as steel. "But combined with their behavioral responses, the evidence suggests these cubs were stolen from their natural habitat and subjected to experimental procedures by humans. The question is, who would do such a thing, and why?" Agent Collins was taking detailed notes, her official demeanor shifting toward genuine investigation. "Dr. Clearwater, are you suggesting these animals are evidence in a federal wildlife trafficking case?" "I'm suggesting that before we worry about Mr. Whitehorse's permits, we should be asking how two traumatized wolf cubs ended up abandoned on Cherokee sacred ground, and whether the person demanding their removal might have ulterior motives." The accusation hit Tom like a physical blow. His composure cracked completely, revealing something raw and desperate beneath the polished businessman facade. "This is insane. I'm trying to help these animals get proper care, and you're treating me like some kind of criminal." "Nobody's treating you like anything," Ben said quietly, but his eyes never left Tom's face. "We're just wondering why a Atlanta developer knows so much about wolf behavior and why these cubs react to you like they've seen the devil himself." Deputy Morrison stepped forward, his hand instinctively moving toward his radio. The situation was spiraling beyond a simple wildlife violation into something that might require backup and investigative resources far beyond his small-town experience. But it was Joseph Clearwater who cut through the tension with the wisdom of a man who'd spent decades reading the truth behind human facades. "Mr. Ravencroft," he said, his voice carrying the authority of tribal eldership, "these mountains have a way of revealing secrets that people would rather keep buried. You can continue this charade, or you can tell us why these cubs know your voice." Tom's breathing became labored, his expensive suit suddenly looking like armor that no longer fit properly. The mask of corporate competence was slipping away, revealing something that looked suspiciously like a man carrying unbearable guilt. "You don't understand," Tom said, his voice cracking with strain. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt. The research was supposed to help people, supposed to make a difference." The confession hung in the air like a thunderclap. Agent Collins stepped closer, her investigative instincts fully engaged. "Mr. Ravencroft, are you admitting involvement in illegal wildlife research?" Tom's hands shook as he reached into his jacket pocket, but instead of producing another business card, he pulled out a crumpled photograph. The image showed a young girl, perhaps 8 years old, with Tom's eyes and a smile that spoke of innocence not yet touched by the world's cruelties. "My daughter Emma," Tom whispered, his voice breaking entirely. "She was in a car accident 3 years ago. Traumatic brain injury. She hasn't spoken a word since." The revelation shifted the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Here was a father's desperation made manifest, a man who'd apparently crossed legal and ethical lines in pursuit of something that might heal his broken child. "The research facility in North Carolina?" Tom continued, the words pouring out like confession at a deathbed. They were studying communication patterns in wolf cubs, trying to understand how brain trauma affects vocalization instincts. The cubs were supposed to be returned to the wild after the study was complete. Liz's expression hardened with professional outrage. Supposed to be returned? What happened, Mr. Ravencroft? The facility lost their federal funding, budget cuts, bureaucratic red tape. The researchers were told to terminate the study and dispose of the subjects. Tom's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I couldn't let them be euthanized. I took the cubs and brought them here to the only place I could think of where they might have a chance. Ben felt the pieces of a terrible puzzle clicking into place. You brought them to my property specifically. This wasn't random. Tom nodded miserably. I've been watching this place for months, researching your family's history with wildlife conservation. I hoped you might care for them until I could figure out a permanent solution. And the development scheme? Joseph pressed. A cover story. I needed a legitimate reason to be in the area to monitor the cubs' progress without arousing suspicion. The resort proposal was never real. Agent Collins was writing furiously, documenting admissions that would likely result in multiple federal charges. But her expression had shifted from official enforcement to something approaching understanding. The line between criminal and victim was rarely as clear as legal textbooks suggested. Echo had stopped growling, his keen animal instincts apparently recognizing that Tom's emotional collapse represented no immediate threat. The cub approached cautiously, sniffing the air around the broken man with the kind of curiosity that suggested forgiveness might be possible even in the darkest circumstances. Mr. Ravencroft, Ben said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of paternal understanding, you should have just asked for help. Tom looked up with eyes red from unshed tears. Would you have said yes? Would any of you have risked everything for a stranger's desperate gamble? The question hung in the mountain air, unanswered but profoundly felt. In a world where good intentions collided with impossible circumstances, where love drove people to make choices that defied both law and logic, who could say with certainty what they would do when faced with a child's suffering? As storm clouds gathered over the Smoky Mountains, the assembled group faced truths more complex than any legal statute or bureaucratic procedure could address. Sometimes the line between salvation and destruction was drawn by nothing more substantial than a parent's breaking heart. The storm that had been threatening all afternoon finally broke with the fury that only mountain weather could deliver. Thunder rolled across the peaks like the voices of ancient gods, and lightning illuminated the cabin in stark white flashes that sent both cubs scrambling for cover beneath Ben's kitchen table. Agent Collins had called for backup and a federal wildlife transport team, but the deteriorating weather conditions meant they were stranded at Ben's cabin for the foreseeable future. The group had moved inside, where the cramped quarters forced an uncomfortable intimacy between people who'd been adversaries just hours before. Tom sat slumped in Martha's old rocking chair, the photograph of his daughter clutched in trembling hands. The expensive suit that had made him look so formidable in the afternoon sun now hung on his frame like a costume that no longer fit. His confession had stripped away more than just his false identity. It had revealed the hollow desperation of a father watching his child slip away one silent day at a time. Emma used to sing, Tom whispered, his voice barely audible above the thunder. She had this little song she made up about butterflies and rainbows. After the accident, the doctors said she might never speak again. 3 years of surgeries, therapy, experimental treatments, nothing worked. Liz moved quietly around the kitchen, preparing coffee and sandwiches with the automatic efficiency of someone accustomed to crisis situations. But Ben could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands shook slightly as she worked. As a veterinarian, she'd dedicated her life to healing wounded creatures. But the ethical violations Tom had described challenged everything she believed about the proper treatment of animals. "The research facility," she said finally, not turning from the stove. "What exactly were they doing to these cubs?" Tom's laugh was bitter and broken. "They called it non-invasive neurological monitoring. Electrodes attached to their skulls, recording brain activity while they tried to vocalize. The theory was that understanding how trauma affected communication in wolves might provide insights for treating similar injuries in humans." Echo poked his head out from under the table, his amber eyes fixed on Tom with an expression that seemed almost like recognition. The cub's earlier aggression had faded, replaced by a wariness that suggested he understood the difference between intentional cruelty and misguided desperation. "They were kept in cages," Tom continued, his voice growing stronger as he purged himself of months of suppressed guilt. "Small spaces, no contact with other animals, minimal human interaction except during testing sessions. The researchers insisted it was necessary for data integrity, but I could see what it was doing to them." Agent Collins looked up from her notes, her professional demeanor softening slightly. "Mr. Ravencroft, you're describing conditions that would constitute animal abuse under federal law. Why didn't you report the facility?" "Because they were the only hope I had left for Emma." Tom's words came out raw and desperate. "The lead researcher, Dr. Patricia Vance, promised me that their findings could revolutionize treatment for traumatic brain injuries. She said Emma could be in the first wave of patients to benefit from the breakthrough." Ben felt a familiar ache in his chest, the echo of his own desperate bargaining with fate during Martha's illness. How many experimental treatments had he researched? How many miracle cures had he prayed for? How many moral compromises had he been willing to make for just one more day with the woman he loved? "When did you realize it wasn't going to work?" Ben asked quietly. Tom's composure cracked completely. 6 weeks ago. Dr. Vance admitted that the research was going nowhere, that the cubs weren't responding to the stimuli the way they'd hoped. The facility's funding was already being cut, and they were preparing to euthanize the subjects rather than face the expense of proper rehabilitation. Lightning struck somewhere close, the thunder following immediately with a crack that shook the cabin's windows. Whisper whimpered softly from beneath the table, the first sound she'd made since Joseph's arrival. Echo immediately moved to comfort her, his larger body shielding her from the storm's fury. "That's when I made the decision," Tom continued. "I told Dr. Vance I wanted to adopt the cubs for a private facility, paid her $20,000 cash, and drove straight here without stopping. I'd been researching your family for months, Mr. Whitehorse. Your reputation for wildlife conservation, your grandfather's relationship with the Cherokee Nation, your son's work with injured animals before he died." The mention of David hit Ben like a physical blow. His son had indeed worked with wildlife rehabilitation before the logging accident that took his life, and the parallel between David's compassion and Tom's desperate love for his daughter was too obvious to ignore. "You knew about David," Ben said, the words heavy with realization. Tom nodded miserably. "I read every newspaper article, every Forest Service report he filed. He saved dozens of animals during his career, treated them like family members rather than just wildlife. I hoped that compassion might run in the family." Deputy Morrison's radio crackled to life, the dispatcher's voice barely audible through the static caused by the storm. "All units, be advised that severe weather conditions have closed Highway 441, emergency vehicles only until further notice." Agent Collins sighed, accepting that her investigation would have to wait until morning. "Mr. Ravencroft, you understand that I'll have to place you under arrest once transportation becomes available. Federal wildlife trafficking charges carry serious penalties." "I know," Tom replied, his voice empty of fight. "I've known since the day I took them. But I couldn't watch them die for nothing, not when Emma's still fighting to find her voice." Joseph Clearwater had remained silent throughout Tom's confession, his weathered hands gently stroking Whisper's fur as the small cub gradually emerged from hiding. The tribal elder's dark eyes held the kind of wisdom that came from witnessing decades of human struggle, the understanding that good people sometimes made terrible choices when love and desperation collided. "Tom," Joseph said finally, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd mediated countless conflicts, "what you did was wrong, but your heart was in the right place, and that matters more than you might think." Ben watched as Echo approached Tom's chair, the cub's movements cautious but no longer fearful. After a moment's hesitation, Echo placed his head on Tom's knee, offering the kind of forgiveness that only innocent creatures could provide. Tom's breath caught in his throat as he tentatively reached out to stroke Echo's fur. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words directed as much to the cubs as to the humans in the room. "I'm so damn sorry for all of it." The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin, something like peace had settled over the unlikely gathering. Liz served coffee and sandwiches, the simple act of sharing food creating a fragile sense of community among people who'd been strangers and adversaries just hours before. "There might be a way to make this right," Joseph said thoughtfully, accepting a mug of coffee with grateful hands. "The Cherokee Nation has been working to establish a wildlife rehabilitation center for years. Federal funding, proper facilities, trained staff. These cubs could be the catalyst for making that dream a reality." Agent Collins looked up with interest. "A tribal facility would have different regulatory requirements than private ownership. If the Cherokee Nation formally requested custody of the cubs for rehabilitation purposes, it would buy us time," Ben finished, understanding the implications. "Time for the cubs to heal properly. Time to determine the best path forward." Tom looked up with something that might have been hope flickering in his eyes. "And Emma, is there any way—" "There are legitimate research programs studying animal-assisted therapy for traumatic brain injuries," Liz said carefully. "Programs that operate within ethical guidelines and don't involve harming the animals. If your daughter could benefit from that kind of interaction." The conversation continued as the storm raged outside. 3 generations of mountain people and one desperate father trying to forge a solution that honored both justice and mercy. In the corner, 2 wolf cubs who'd lost their voices began to remember what safety felt like, their healing journey intertwined with the humans who'd found their own paths to redemption in the most unexpected places. Sometimes, Ben reflected, as he watched Echo and Whisper settle down for sleep, the mountains called their children home just when they needed it most. And sometimes, home was big enough to shelter even the most broken hearts. The morning after the storm dawned with crystalline clarity, as if the mountain air had been washed clean of all deception and pretense. Ben woke to find both cubs curled beside his bed, their presence a comfort he hadn't realized he'd been craving since Martha's death. For the first time in 3 years, he didn't wake up alone with his grief. But the peaceful moment shattered when he heard voices outside, multiple vehicles, official radios crackling, the unmistakable sounds of a federal operation in motion. Through his bedroom window, Ben could see Agent Collins coordinating with a team of wildlife officers, while a specialized transport vehicle equipped with animal cages sat ominously in his driveway. Echo and Whisper sensed the tension immediately, retreating beneath Ben's bed with the kind of terrified silence that spoke of remembered trauma. They'd been here before, the official voices, the cages, the clinical efficiency of people who saw them as subjects rather than souls. "Easy, little ones," Ben whispered, kneeling beside the bed to offer what comfort he could. "We're going to figure this out." but his promise felt hollow as he watched Tom being led toward a federal transport vehicle, his hands cuffed behind his back with the cold efficiency of justice that rarely accounted for the complexities of human motivation. Tom's confession had sealed his fate legally, even if it had opened possibilities for the cub's future. Liz appeared in the doorway, her face grim with the weight of impending loss. The Cherokee Nation's request for custody is still working its way through bureaucratic channels. Could take weeks. The Federal Wildlife Service won't wait that long. Ben's chest tightened with familiar helplessness, the same feeling he'd experienced watching Martha waste away despite every medical intervention, the same crushing awareness that love wasn't always enough to save what mattered most. "There's something else," Liz continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Agent Collins found records from the research facility. Echo and Whisper aren't the only cubs that were taken. There were 6 others, and none of them survived the experiments." The revelation hit Ben like a physical blow. These 2 traumatized creatures weren't just victims, they were survivors, the only living witnesses to systematic abuse that had killed their siblings. The responsibility of protecting them suddenly felt monumentally larger than one old man's fight against foreclosure. Joseph Clearwater arrived as the federal team was preparing to load the cubs into transport cages, his presence commanding immediate attention despite his advanced age. He carried with him a manila folder thick with legal documents and the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades navigating the intersection of tribal sovereignty and federal law. "Agent Collins," Joseph announced, his voice carrying across the clearing with surprising strength, "I have a federal court injunction blocking the removal of these animals pending resolution of jurisdictional disputes." The wildlife agent paused, clearly unprepared for this level of legal sophistication from a rural tribal elder. She accepted the documents with professional courtesy, but her expression suggested that federal bureaucracy didn't often bend to accommodate such complications. "Mr. Clearwater, while I respect tribal sovereignty, these animals require immediate medical attention and proper rehabilitation facilities. Mr. Whitehorse's property isn't equipped for long-term care of traumatized wildlife." "Then perhaps it's time to change that," came a new voice from the edge of the clearing. Ben turned to see a woman approaching from the forest path. Tall, dignified, with the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. "Doctor." Elena Blackhorse, according to Joseph's introduction, was the Cherokee Nation's newly appointed Director of Wildlife Conservation, a position that hadn't existed a week ago but had been created with remarkable speed once the tribe understood what was at stake. "Dr. Blackhorse," Agent Collins said, consulting her paperwork with visible confusion. "I don't have any record of your department in our interagency database." Elena's smile was patient but unmistakably determined. "Federal recognition of tribal conservation departments often lags behind our actual capabilities, Agent Collins, but I can assure you that our facilities and expertise meet or exceed federal standards for wildlife rehabilitation." She gestured toward the forest, where Ben could now see construction equipment moving between the trees. A small army of workers who had apparently arrived under cover of pre-dawn darkness. The Cherokee Nation wasn't just claiming jurisdiction, they were creating the infrastructure to support it. "Remarkable efficiency," Agent Collins observed, her tone caught between admiration and suspicion. "Remarkable motivation," Elena corrected. "These cubs represent more than just wildlife conservation. They're symbols of survival against systematic oppression, creatures who've endured trauma and emerged with their capacity for trust intact. The Cherokee Nation has some experience with that particular kind of resilience." As if summoned by the discussion of their fate, Echo emerged from beneath Ben's bed, moving with deliberate purpose toward the screen door. His amber eyes fixed on the assembled officials with something that looked less like fear and more like assessment, as if he understood that his future was being decided and wanted some input in the process. Tom, still in federal custody but allowed to observe from the patrol car, watched through the window with an expression of desperate hope. His daughter Emma's photograph remained clutched in his cuffed hands, a reminder of the love that had driven him to such desperate measures. "There's been a development in Mr. Ravencroft's case," Agent Collins announced, consulting her phone for messages that had apparently arrived during the jurisdictional negotiations. The research facility he mentioned, Dr. Patricia Vance and her team, are now under federal investigation for animal abuse and fraud. His cooperation in that investigation could significantly impact his sentencing. Ben felt a surge of something that might have been vindication. Tom's guilt was real, but it existed within a larger web of institutional cruelty that deserved its own reckoning. Sometimes justice required looking beyond individual actions to systemic failures. Whisper appeared at the screen door beside Echo, her injured leg bearing weight more confidently than it had since her arrival. The smaller cub pressed against her companion's side, and for the first time since Ben had found them, both cubs vocalized simultaneously. Not the fearful whimpers he'd expected, but a soft, harmonious sound that spoke of communication and mutual support. "They're talking to each other," Liz observed with wonder. "After days of silence, they're actually communicating." The moment felt profoundly significant, as if the cubs were demonstrating their readiness to engage with the world again. Their healing wasn't complete, but it was undeniably real, a testament to the power of patient care and unconditional acceptance. Dr. Blackhorse knelt near the screen door, extending her hand toward the cubs with the practiced patience of someone accustomed to working with traumatized animals. Echo approached first, his investigation cautious but thorough. When he didn't retreat, Whisper followed, both cubs eventually allowing themselves to be examined by yet another stranger. "Their physical condition has improved dramatically," Elena observed, her professional assessment carrying weight that Agent Collins couldn't easily dismiss. "Psychological trauma of this severity typically requires months of specialized care. Removing them from this environment now could undo weeks of progress." Agent Collins was clearly struggling with competing priorities: federal regulations that demanded immediate action, bureaucratic pressure to resolve the situation efficiently, and growing evidence that the cubs' current care might be the best option available. "Dr. Blackhorse, if the Cherokee Nation assumes custody, what guarantees can you provide regarding the cubs' welfare and eventual release?" Elena's response was immediate and comprehensive. Full veterinary support, including Dr. Clearwater's continued involvement as primary care provider. Gradual reintroduction to pack behavior through interaction with other rescued wolves. Eventual release to protected habitat when they demonstrate readiness. And most importantly, continued connection to the human family that began their healing process. She gestured toward Ben, who had emerged from the cabin to stand beside the cubs with obvious reluctance to be separated from them. Mr. Whitehorse's bond with these animals isn't just emotional, it's therapeutic. They trust him in ways that will be crucial for their continued recovery. The federal agent looked around at the assembled faces: tribal officials, local law enforcement, a desperate father, an old man who'd found purpose in protecting two orphaned souls, and the cubs themselves, who seemed to understand that their fate hung in the balance of human decisions. "I need to make some calls," Agent Collins said finally, her official demeanor softening slightly. "There are precedents for interagency cooperation in cases involving tribal sovereignty and wildlife conservation. It might be possible to structure a collaborative custody arrangement." As she walked away to consult with her superiors, Ben felt the first stirring of hope he'd experienced since the crisis began. Sometimes, he reflected, the mountains really did protect their own. 6 months later, the morning sun painted the great Smoky Mountains in shades of gold and amber as Ben Whitehorse stood on his rebuilt porch, watching Echo and Whisper play in the meadow that had once been threatened by corporate development. The cubs had grown into magnificent young wolves, their traumatic silence replaced by a rich vocabulary of howls, yips, and contented rumbles that filled the mountain air with the music of healing. The Whitehorse Cherokee Wildlife Rehabilitation Center occupied 40 acres of protected habitat, its rustic buildings designed to blend seamlessly with the forest landscape. Federal funding, combined with tribal resources and private donations inspired by the Cubs' story, had created something unprecedented, a facility that honored both scientific excellence and traditional ecological wisdom. Ben's financial worries had evaporated like morning mist. His new position as cultural liaison and senior wildlife guardian provided not just a living wage, but a sense of purpose that made each day feel like a gift rather than an obligation. The medical debt that had once threatened to consume his remaining years was gone, paid by the Cherokee Nation as part of their commitment to protecting the man who'd protected their sacred animals. Echo bounded across the meadow with the confident grace of a natural leader, his silver-gray coat gleaming in the sunlight. The larger wolf had grown into his protective instincts, serving as both guardian and guide for his smaller companion. His amber eyes held intelligence and trust that spoke of complete recovery from the trauma that had once stolen his voice. Whisper moved with careful dignity despite her healed leg, which would always carry a slight limp as a reminder of her ordeal. But the injury no longer defined her. She'd discovered a gift for nurturing that made her invaluable in helping newly rescued animals adjust to sanctuary life. Her gentle presence could calm the most frightened creatures, offering them the same patient acceptance she'd received during her darkest hours. "Morning, you two," Ben called softly, his voice carrying the warm affection of a grandfather watching beloved grandchildren at play. Both wolves turned at the sound, their tails wagging with unrestrained joy before they raced toward the porch with bounding enthusiasm. Liz emerged from the clinic building, carrying her morning coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose life's work had finally found its perfect expression. Her veterinary practice had not only survived, but thrived as the rehabilitation center's primary medical facility. She'd become something more than a rural vet. She was a pioneer in trauma-informed animal care, her techniques studied by researchers across the country. "The new cubs arrived this morning," she announced, settling into the rocking chair that had become her customary spot during their daily briefings. 3 siblings from a facility in Virginia that was shut down for violations. They're in quarantine now, but I think Echo and Whisper will be instrumental in their rehabilitation. Ben nodded, understanding the profound truth behind her words. The wolves who'd once been victims had become healers themselves, their capacity for trust and forgiveness serving as a model for other traumatized animals. Their story had become legend in wildlife conservation circles, proof that even the deepest wounds could heal when tended with patience and love. A familiar pickup truck appeared on the winding road, carrying visitors who'd become as essential to the sanctuary's mission as the animals themselves. Tom Ravencroft, now Thomas Whitehorse again, his original name legally restored as part of his journey toward redemption, climbed out of the driver's seat with movements that spoke of earned peace rather than desperate ambition. Beside him, 8-year-old Emma Whitehorse stepped onto the mountain soil with the careful wonder of a child still learning to trust the world again. Her speech had returned gradually through months of animal-assisted therapy, not through the violent intervention Tom had once sought, but through the gentle presence of creatures who understood what it meant to lose and rediscover one's voice. "Uncle Ben!" Emma called, her words clear and joyful as she ran toward the porch where Echo and Whisper waited with patient enthusiasm. The wolves had learned to moderate their exuberance around the small girl, understanding instinctively that she required the same careful healing they'd once needed. Tom followed his daughter at a more measured pace, his face bearing the lines of a man who'd stared into the abyss of his own desperation and found his way back to the light. His federal sentence had been reduced to community service at the rehabilitation center, a punishment that had become the most meaningful work of his life. "Dad's home," Tom said simply, the words carrying weight that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with belonging. Ben smiled, watching as 3 generations of his chosen family gathered in the golden morning light. The mountains had indeed called their children home, creating a family bound not by blood alone, but by shared commitment to protecting the vulnerable and healing the broken. As Echo's powerful howl rose into the mountain air, answered immediately by Whisper's gentler voice, the forest itself seemed to exhale with satisfaction. Some things were worth more than money, and some families were worth more than pride. Love didn't need words to be heard, it just needed the courage to make itself known. The wolves had found their voices again, and in doing so, had taught the humans around them how to speak the language of hope. At 68, Ben Whitehorse thought his story was over. Buried under medical debt, facing foreclosure, haunted by the loss of his son and wife. Like so many of us in our golden years, he felt invisible, forgotten, convinced his best days were behind him. But 2 silent wolf cubs changed everything. They reminded him that sometimes our greatest purpose reveals itself not in our youth, but in our wisdom years. When we finally understand that love isn't measured by what we accumulate, but by what we're willing to protect. Ben's mountain cabin became a sanctuary not just for wounded animals, but for wounded hearts learning to trust again. His story proves that it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be, to build the family you need, to find meaning that transcends material success. The cubs lost their voices but found their healing through an old man's patient love. In return, they gave him something priceless, the knowledge that being needed is life's greatest gift. Sometimes God sends angels with 4 legs and golden eyes to remind us that our final chapters can be our most beautiful ones. Your story isn't over either. Questions for reflection. What silent cubs in your life might be waiting for your care and attention? When did you last feel truly needed, and how did that change your perspective on aging? Share your thoughts below. Your story matters and someone needs to hear it today.